right. Well, hello and welcome back to the second of four virtual events in our annual TPI Winter Spectrum Series. Today, we will be discussing CBRS in 2026. What have we learned? Joining us today are Tom Power, Paroma Sanyal, Mary Claire York, Arpan Sura, and I'm Sarah Olam. So let's start by reviewing the history of CBRS really quickly. It's been 14 years since the first NPRM, 6 years since the PAL auction. The Citizens Broadband Radio Service on the 3.5 gigahertz band was started with an NPRM in 2012, had earlier roots in the 2010 NTIA Fast Track Report, was developed into a three-tiered license system with a SAS SAS database administrators, PALS priority access licensees, GAA users, general authorized access users. You have military radar on the coasts. And so it's pretty complicated of a scheme. There was a further notice for proposed rulemaking in 2014 and an order in 2015 establishing the framework. There were refinements to the rules and the schemata in 2016, 2017, 2018. And now here we are. Oh, and then 2020, there was auction 105. So 70 megahertz of PAL licenses were auctioned. It raised $4.6 billion. Over 200 winning bidders or entities secured over 20,000 PAL licenses. And then since then, we've had an NTIA report in 2023 on deployments that were measured between 2021 and 2023, so over those 2 years. And then we have a NPRM that was released by the FCC in November of 2024, or that had a reply comment date of November 2024, asking folks to comment on modernizing Part 96 rules. We don't have an order or a response to that or a further notice. And so that's kind of hanging out there. CBRS 2.0 is kind of was rolled out in 2023, 2024, which was kind of modifications, extending the footprint available to users. There was like technical upgrades, like a heartbeat timer upgrade, interference models to shrink protected zones, and new technical specifications for GAA users. And so, yeah, that brings us to now, today, 2026. There's discussion around the band. It's so close to the upper C band, it's mid band. Is the band being used well? Who's using it? And how does it fit into just spectrum, the ecosystem as a whole? So I thought it'd be great to be talking about our first question of like, all the users that are on the band. Can we hear about what's the current state of demand and supply for that particular spectrum? And what's in this docket that's still hanging out there about modernizing the rules? So just some popcorn time if you guys have comments or thoughts.
Sure, I'll hop in. I think demand and supply is and Paroma can interrupt me because she's the actual economist here, but in terms of demand and supply, we can see that there are over 430,000 deployed CBSDs. Over 80% of counties have CBRS deployments. There's robust GAA use, as you mentioned, that's licensed by rule. We've also got robust PAL use. CBRS 2.0 is now several years old. And then if you look at the PAL auction in terms of supply and demand, there was a real demand based on the rule setup and the innovation band for new bidders. The PAL auction had a record of 228 bidders, and these were all entities that don't normally participate, WISPs and utilities and enterprise companies. So, I could go on and on and on about uses by CBRS users, but just to your first supply and demand question, there seemed to be a real demand for people for these smaller countywide licenses to make utilization of spectrum in a different and new way.
And I think just to add to that, what is very interesting about this band is sort of the blended approach that operators have taken. The GAA, surprisingly, has become a very active used portion of the band with almost, I think, 70% of the active CBRS usage there, which I think like is a 2024 number. The PAL usage is increasing, and even sort of the within band, the average utilization is increasing. So I think we are finally moving from sort of the experimental part of is the CBRS 3 tier working to actually seeing band maturity and the band really being used to the fullest extent.
I would add that certainly there's been some growth. It's been a little choppy. We when I was at CTIA, we commissioned some drive tests. This is a few years ago, admittedly, but it showed that, in some cities, less than 10% or 20%, certainly well under 50% of the city being covered by CBRS, and this was we compared that to C-band coverage from licensed carriers, and we were well over 90% of C-band. There is a lot of rural counties with CBRS coverage, but we know the number of counties. It doesn't really tell you about the extent of the coverage. And licensed carriers typically have to demonstrate coverage by proportion of the geography covered or portion of the population covered, and we haven't seen that kind of measurement for CBRS. So it's we really don't know the scope of the coverage, and I think the SAS administrators have this data. It would be really useful to see it to really judge how extensively CBRS has been deployed.
I think, Tom, to your point, another interesting part about the band is we're talking about success of a band that hasn't even reached its initial build out deadline. So, in 2030, theoretically, we'll get a great picture of, people hopefully meeting their build out deadlines. They'll tell us the substantial service they're providing, and then we'll have a great, first picture of where this new band has gone and the number of deployments that have rolled out there.
I had read about it was one of the SAS administrators that put out a report that suggested that the number of the total number of CBSDs being deployed has the increase has greatly decreased. They indicated that from September of 24 to 25, there was only an increase of 13,000 CBSDs compared to prior years where the increases were in the 80 to 100,000 range. So I agree. It'll be good to see where things when we have the data to see where things are really going.
Arpan, do you have thoughts about just the way FCC is thinking about CBRS, maybe in context of other spectrum or just in particular that band?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Arpan Sur here with the FCC. I work for Chairman Carr. I'm his wireless advisor. I wanted to start by picking up on some of the dialogue that Tom and Mary Claire were having. And, it seemed like there was a presupposition that the number of registered CBSDs were indicative of utilization. And I want to sort of interrogate that and ask you, by the time 2030 comes around, what do you think are the right benchmarks for assessing whether the band has been properly utilized? I'd be interested in your thoughts. Thanks.
So I think there are two things related to, success or usage. One is the FCC voted to create an innovation band, and that's what we have. So on the one side, we have wireless networks. It's the exclusive use, full power, deployed networks, lots and lots of capacity, and that's 800, 700, 2.5, 600. Name all the number salad, right? Like the vast majority of the spectrum is controlled by 3 MNOs under this same formula, and CBRS was set up differently. And so the success there is going to look different than a carrier deploying a macro tower. You just don't evaluate it in the same way. So part of that, I think, is seeing the targeted deployments where people are. It's not just the capacity, it's the coverage. It's a tribal nation saying, we set up our own private network because we couldn't get service another way, and this was the faster economic way to go. You can measure it in terms of new licensees, the breadth and diversity. You can measure it by the fact that we've been able to share, we being users of the band have been able to share with the Navy with no interference instances. So the framework itself is working. And this also, keep in mind, does include nationwide carriers who are using the band to add capacity in dense urban areas. But it's also the competition that other providers are bringing to the network. So it's innovation, and it's a different measure of success than just we're building a tower, right? So we not only in the band, like I take your point on the number of CBSDs, right? But one of the ways that we can compare in the global spectrum arms race is densification. And China, leaving aside the mid-band spectrum debate, we have a big build out and density gap with China. And so you're seeing these CBRS networks densify and add, they're getting out of congestion with densification. And it's not just speed, it's coverage and ubiquity. So there are all these inputs into success in the CBRS band that I think are just different than the traditional bands. And that was, circling back to the beginning, what the FCC intended when they created a completely new framework.
So I think, Arpan, that's a great question. And anything you can't measure, you cannot sort of really know what success is. So I think metrics are really important. And going back to what Mary Claire said, sort of from, more from the economics perspective, I think utilization is really important. All those channels, say for PAL, are all those channels being used? Because early on, not all the channels that were allocated were used. Are they underutilized or not? Second, of course, with the GAA, what is really important is the mix of the players, because again, with the innovation band, this was really important. How are the utilities using it? Where is their value coming from? But at the end of the day, I think between the exclusive spectrum and shared, it's really a more complementary approach. They're not substitutes. You cannot sort of, trade off really one for the other. And it's this complementarity that really is going to push, I think, the spectrum policy and usage forward.
I recall some years ago, NTIA undertook what they called a quantitative assessment of federal usage, and they looked at how much spectrum are you occupying, where geographically are you occupying it, and how often are you using it from a time dimension. And I think those are the kinds of measurements you need to do to really understand if it's being used efficiently. I think it's funny. I know it's called the innovation band, but it looks like most of the usage is just to enhance existing uses that don't hinge on CBRS, whether that's mobile broadband or fixed wireless at home. You don't need CBRS to do those things. You can use CBRS to do those things, but then we're constrained by these lower power levels, which I don't think is terribly helpful, particularly in rural areas where higher power levels could obviously have wider coverage. And the densification point is interesting because, again, you can engineer a high power network in a way that achieves the densification that now we sort of have to shoehorn in with CBRS because it's at lower power levels, requiring more deployments as opposed to having higher power and fewer deployments, which I think could be more efficient.
Sorry, go ahead.
If the numbers showed that the band was being used like almost exclusively for capacity offload in some form or fashion rather than like private wireless networks, would that change your view about whether the band is being used to its full potential?
I guess it depends. You described the nature of the use. I guess it depends then on how much of it is being used, right? I think if it's being used for traditional services, then it sort of shows we don't really need the CBRS model.
I mean, I think I'm from a rural area, so I have a little bit of a heart for sort of these smaller players, right? And I think if you look in the docket in the last several months, we've got, big to small, right? We've got a school district of a couple thousand students using it for a private 5G network, all the way up to the Marine Corps that deployed it in a 700,000 square foot logistics base in Georgia. And the Marine Corps is using it for, they're reducing operational labor costs. They're able to, meet all their accuracy frameworks. We've got airports using it for inspection and diagnostics. And then we've got like little bitty Castleberry Independent School District that's using it for whatever they need it for. So I think there are a range of uses, and a lot of those people have started speaking up when they found out that the FCC had a rulemaking, and it's like, wait, we invested in this, we're using it. Even some of those rural broadband providers are saying this intersects with our BEAD bids, right? So I don't think it's I think that there's a soup to nuts range of uses, but some of those are really, really small players, and so they're just not popping up like this, standard uses that we in DC are used to.
So to go through a little bit more quantitatively, like valuation, if you have to put $1 to the megahertz, like, complementarity, diversity, you can't really put $1 on that amount. The auction proceeds were what, $4.6 billion for the PAL licenses, which were mostly from known like carriers. Verizon bid $1.8 billion for 557 PALs. Dish Network bid 900 million for 5,000 PALs. Charter had 200 PALs for 400 million. Comcast 400 million for 830 PALs. Cox has spent 200 million for 470 PALs. So, putting aside the GAA users, what kind of investment would you consider that for the PALs? And they're using it for, I guess, capacity offload or private wireless networking. How do you consider the PALs in the ecosystem?
Well, yeah, you're right. I think 16 of the 20 biggest bidders were traditional companies. And look, you put spectrum out there, whether you put it out there perfectly or imperfectly, folks will find a way to use it and put it to use. And that's what we saw. In fact, when we did those drive tests, 93% of the usage that we tested a few years ago was Verizon itself. So I think the PALs are largely being used, as I said, for that traditional, whether it's fixed wireless or mobile broadband. I understand Mary Claire's point. There are certainly other uses out there, but I guess I keep returning to the point that those uses don't necessarily hinge on CBRS. They are using CBRS, but they wouldn't have to use CBRS.
Sarah, that's sort of an interesting question for me because we've done sort of a paper a couple of years back that actually tried to tease apart sort of, why the 22 cents a megahertz in CBRS versus, say, the 73 or 74 cents at 3.45, where, 3.45 also had those coastal areas, but exclusive, and this also had impairments, but shared. And we really went back to a very Coasian view of property rights, trying to figure out what is the bundle of rights that were included in the CBRS license versus something like a C-band versus 3.45. And if you could tease apart all the different rights from it and figure out what it is that was driving sort of that 22 cents nationwide pricing that we saw. And one of the conclusions from our paper that we saw is it wasn't as much the sharing regime, it was really the uncertainty that was around what was going to happen to this PAL versus GAA and how the interference were going to work, which is what sort of pushed down the price. And also, I think, we, of course, focus on auction revenues a lot as a metric for success. However, for a shared band, I think, as Mary Claire said, other things like the other externalities that this band generates is important in really figuring out where this band sits in the ecosystem of exclusive to unlicensed.
I think I would also just very gently push back, on Tom and the drive test. I think we do have a lot of people in the docket who are saying this is affordable, reliable, available spectrum that we can't get another way. Or at least they perceive that they can't get another way. And that's what a lot of these entities have said in the record, that this was our entry point into the spectrum. So, there are people who can't get CBRS another way. And whether efficiency or higher power, we can debate that all day long. But if you raise the power, you do blow out some of those other users. And so it does necessarily preclude a lot of people coexisting. That's the nature of a shared band.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. And one, I just want to go back to something Paroma said, and not to go too abstract, but I do think it's funny we call this a shared band in the sense that you start with DoD, who gets whatever they want exclusively, and then you have PALs, which are exclusive licenses, and then you have GAA. So, if this is sharing, then I think everything's sharing, right? Like if a PAL license is part of sharing, then all licenses are sharing. Anyway, just kind of an abstract point. And Mary Claire, to your point, certainly there are folks who have already invested and relied on the rules as they exist. And if there were to be any changes, you'd have to consider those reliance interests and figure out what to do about that. Sarah, you're on mute.
Sarah.
Thanks. So, right, going back to 2020 when there was uncertainty, like Paroma said, and even going back further, 2012, 2013, when this whole design was being put together, there were a lot of unknowns. It was experimental. Can't think of any other band that looks kind of like this, like a 3-tiered system. But here we are 15 years later, we have data, we see deployments, and true, it's not complete yet. So 4 more years until 2030. And, technology is changing every day. And, who knows, maybe we'll see an explosion of like private LTE, like a new use case that really that brings in lots more devices. But just a question about if you put yourself back to 2012, and Tom, you were around OSTP then, and Paroma, Mary, you guys were at the FCC. Is this kind of what you would have thought would have happened, like with the band, or like how is today comparing with what was happening then?
I'll just jump in with a little background. Yeah, I was at OSTP in the White House under the Obama administration, and the PCAST, which is the Presidential Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. It's an advisory committee, really accomplished people in business, in academia. Back then, we had Eric Schmidt, we had Nobel Prize winners, a lot of really impressive people, and they undertook a study of spectrum and came up with, I think, was the initial kind of CBRS type design. I think looking back, and I know ARPAN must live with this today, the regulator or policymakers want to obviously do whatever is best to enhance consumer welfare and productivity and all that. So you sort of have to have a crystal ball and look into the future and think, all right, what's the ideal future state? But you don't want to put your thumb on the scale and sort of dictate some specific approach that then everyone will build to. So you're always having to balance between necessarily having to look into the future without having to, foreordain the future. So I think, what has emerged is pretty much the model that what the PCAST undertook to design. And I think it's sort of rolled out maybe the way we would expect. The PAL licenses didn't garner; they had the lower lower cost, because you had these power limits and uncertainty about both GAA and DoD. Obviously, we've had some corrections there and shrunken the exclusion zones, which is good. So it's like any kind of new approach, you're going to jump into it. There's going to be uncertainty at the beginning. Hopefully you work out the edges and the rough spots and continue to improve the service and enhance consumer welfare.
So yeah, I think I was at the Office of Strategic Planning around that time. I had just newly joined the FCC, and I could not imagine why there was so much excitement until I realized that this was almost 10 years in the making. To get the DoD to agree to even a sharing framework was something that had not been really done before. It was novel. And I think amongst the economists, there was a lot of excitement about trying to figure out what this three-tier system meant and how the incentives would work and how the bidding would happen. So I remember a lot of discussion regarding how new this was. And we are terrible at having crystal balls. I don't think we did that, but it was just the mechanism was so new that there was a lot of discussion into what would work, what wouldn't. And obviously, that whether it's 70 megahertz versus more and the GAA, that I remember subject to a lot of discussion and what that right limit was.
Yeah. Sarah, to your original question, has the band turned out as originally expected? And I think the answer is tautologically no, because even before the first auction, we updated our rules in 2018 to go from census-based tracks to county-based tracks, to extend the term, to eliminate the N-1 restriction. And then, as Tom notes, over time, we've been upgrading and considering changes to CBRS even after the auction has finished. And as you noted correctly, Sarah, we still have an open NPRM. And so I think if there's one lesson that I think everybody can agree on is that the band hasn't really remained true to its original conception, for better or for worse, and that the FCC over various administrations has continued to iterate based on what we see working and where we think improvements need to be made.
Yeah, I think Arpan's point is really important because CBRS has been an ongoing collaboration between industry, NTIA, specifically the military departments and the commission. And so it just shows how if you're willing to get creative and consider other frameworks and continue the work, you end up with CBRS 2.0. You end up with county license sizes. I was talking to the panelists before we started. One of my first FCC memories is now leadership in this band having a vociferous staff level argument over the niceties of the band. And that's what's great about an iterative rulemaking process in this way that brings in all the people to have a talk about it, is it can evolve and serve multiple different interests so that we can use the spectrum in the best way possible to get the coverage and ubiquity that we need out of our very, very shrinking, spectrum, I don't know what you want to call it, dashboard. ARPAN has a terrible math problem with 800 megahertz. And so when we can consider other creative ways to get spectrum out to other people, that's going to be important as we move forward.
I'm just stuck on Paroma's description of the excited economists. It's just a vision I hadn't had before.
Anytime you put spectrum in front of a bunch of economists of the FCC, I think you're going to have that reaction.
Well, I can't help but note that two economists won a Nobel Prize for perfecting spectrum auctions for licensed spectrum, which, by the way, I think our friend Evan Corwell should have joined in on that. And
Absolutely.
If Nobel Prizes are transferable now, which apparently they are, maybe they could give it to Evan.
Absolutely. Yes. That incentive auction is, I think, one of the biggest successes that we've had. Yeah.
So I thought I'd bring it back to thinking about the band like in the midst of its neighbors. So I had to keep all these numbers straight. So from 3 gigahertz to 4 gigahertz, there's a lot going on. And so that's only 1,000 megahertz. But you've got 3.1 to 3.45, which is DoD use. But you also have PALs between 3.1 and 3.3, I think. 3.3 to 3.45 is 5G, I believe. 3.45 to 3.55 is the 3.45 gigahertz band. That was auction 110. There was $21 billion in that auction. Then you get to CBRS, which is 150 megahertz, so 3.55 to 3.7. and you've got all these various PALs and GAA users. And then you move up the dial at 3.7 to 4. That's the 3.7 or C band. And so that was auction 107. And it was like the big one, $80 billion. They moved out fixed satellite operations out, and then found 280 megahertz for C band. And then now we have this upper C band NPRM at 3.98 to 4.2. And there's an NPRM right now for that auction, which could possibly release as much as 180 megahertz for completion by no later than July 2027. So right smack in the middle of 3 gigahertz, you have the CBRS band, which you've got, and it's experimental. It's like you have all these users. How do you all see like the neighborhood here? And then also, are there like international considerations? Like, so as always, like the US, it could be advantageous or it could be not for the US to be different than the rest of the world. And depending on what you believe in the technology, you'll have an opinion one way or the other. Do you guys have thoughts about CBRS in the middle compared to the rest of this band?
Yeah, that was a major objection, I would say, from the wireless carriers. You're right, DoD is in the lower 3 gigahertz band, and when Congress gave ARPAN and his colleagues the duty to find 800 megahertz, they said, don't touch that. So that's sticking there. We then have the ambit band, that's the 345 to 355, which the carriers have deployed, and they're also up at the C band, and then you have CBRS right in the middle. So whatever the merits of CBRS, I'm not sure it needed to be there, particularly if you're going to limit the power levels, meaning less geographic coverage. You could accomplish that in higher bands that just simply aren't capable of that much coverage. And this is why AT&T actually had proposed moving CBRS down to lower 3 if they could shoehorn it in with DoD down there, and then opening up that what is now the CBRS band to make a huge contiguous band of licensed spectrum. I know that idea has not gotten a lot of momentum behind it, and again, as I indicated earlier, certainly there are folks who have invested in reliance on the existing rules, and if you were to do something like the AT&T plan, you'd have to accommodate those folks either by compensating them for moving or even grandfathering them in place under the existing rules. But the bigger point is we've just always seen sticking CBRS in the middle of a globally harmonized 5G spectrum was something that could have been done differently.
Yeah, I think just to add to Tom's reliance point, I think many users and most have said there's just no way to make the CBRS ecosystem whole, to relocate it to a different frequency range. It's reliance, interest, and investment. It's a lot of small businesses. As I mentioned before, there are BEAD bids that are out there. And in terms of international considerations, 50% of the device approvals or certifications right now are American companies. It is a largely American economic sector in terms of who is developing the equipment, who is using the equipment. It's really an American economic success story, which is, as we know, also a national security success story many times. So, harmonization internationally is great, but it's also great to be a leader and say, this is where we lead, this is where we're putting our money, this is where American innovation and technology is developing. And so in that way, I think it's internationally important for America to continue investing in an innovation band where a lot of Americans are using it and developing technologies.
Yeah, I guess I don't know, two ways of looking at that. You've articulated it one way. I guess the other way, though, is if we're not seeing folks following us in adopting CBRS in other countries, which I don't really think we're seeing. We're certainly seeing more the deployment of private networks, but again, that doesn't hinge on CBRS. And I know 3GPP came up with a standard for CBRS, but it almost feels like it was a standard for one country, which I'm not even sure that's a standard, but I don't know. I see the other side of that coin, which is if CBRS was really a winning idea, we see other countries mirroring it.
Does that bring us back to the challenges of 2012? Like, but then what do you do with the DoD radars in that band? So, like, let's say there was an idea to repack or have an incentive auction. How would you even get around the federal users anymore? So it's like the big from the beginning again.
Actually, DoD is planning to move those radars out. They've developed new radars that are going to operate in a different band. We just don't know the timeline because I don't know if DoD doesn't know or they have lots of complications to work through, budget and all that kind of stuff. But they do plan to move those radars out of CBRS.
As a strictly factual matter, not all the policy decisions were downstream from the existence of the DoD radars. Like the opportunistic use of GAA is to a large extent unrelated to the existence of the military radar. So I think a lot could have been done in hindsight differently, but to a large extent it happened. So.
And I think it goes back to ARPAN's metrics. What we really need before any decision of, whether to sort of have another different allocation of this band or an incentive auction or whether this is the right use. I think hard metrics on how we define success in a spectrum band that is different from an exclusive band and whether there are more efficient uses of the band. I think ultimately it comes back to where the costs and benefits are and a real evaluation of that before any policy sort of change is made or enhancement is made.
Yeah, I think Paruma's right. If we did a drive test of the whole country on every spectrum deployment, I'm sure there would be holes in every band for every company. For that's just the nature. There will be holes in the 5G deployments in rural America, and we've heard our regulators. We've heard it from Commissioner Trustee several times. I heard it yesterday from NTIA Administrator Roth. It's an all of the above spectrum approach, and that includes so much of the pipeline, that includes so much of what's going on out there. And so we're debating this little bitty portion of the band. We're focusing on just the CBRS, but we've got, unlicensed and satellite and upper C-band. We know we have a lot of spectrum coming online for full power exclusive use. So it is an all of the above approach.
Yeah, so can we talk a little bit more about like the diversity of uses? So GAA is lower power, but I looked it up. It's around the same power level as Part 15 unlicensed. It's not exactly the same because there are like two categories, indoor and outdoor use. So it's a little bit different. And the equipment manufacturers are developing their own specs, which are different from just Wi-Fi. How are the private networks or wearables or what kind of potential is there that's different from like the Wi-Fi bands in GAA use? Like, can we imagine like some new use cases here or combinations with the PAL licenses?
I think I'd say in general, anecdotally, a lot of what we've seen is that the same CBRS network can enable innovations, and that once a network is deployed, users will often then find new use cases that they hadn't anticipated. So, John Deere deployed its private 5G network, and then they learned that all they have to do when they replane the factory is just light up new zones, right? That's something they can do. They can add perimeter monitoring and Smart ag is another example where it's precision agriculture, but they can also do crop health monitoring and fertilizer and weather monitoring. You can add on and on and on. And there's a little bit of, in the innovation bucket, not knowing what you can do until you have the opportunity to expand those uses.
Sarah, I think it's something like 95% of the CBS devices are outdoor and they are being used at the higher power limits. So I think demand has as I've said earlier, it's just supporting services that aren't dependent on CBRS, but that's where the demand is. And so you see offload, fixed wireless access to the home, mobile broadband, just traditional uses. Obviously, John Deere is probably the one we hear about the most in terms of really developing it for their own uses. It's been interesting to watch them. But I think the majority of uses are the traditional wireless connectivity.
So that, I guess that brings us to questions like, if you guys could get any data that you wanted, or you could measure it, have a study, or I mean, one thing I would like to see is an update to the NTIA report. I guess there have been industry reports on deployment, but the NTIA one was from 2021 to 2023. So I don't know if they're working on like an update up through 2025 from their perspective. Do you guys have like wish lists of data or studies that would help inform the discussion?
Yeah, I thought they said they were working on a new report. When they put out the first one, I think they had plans to do a second one. I don't know the status of that. But I would just echo what I said earlier. I think actually looking at actual usage as opposed to just the number of grants or the number of devices, which doesn't really quantify usage. I think that would be really helpful to understand.
Yeah, no, I think I would echo Tom there. Really understanding sort of usage and coverage and the mix of people who are using it and why they're at what power level they're using it is also going to be very informative in how this band is used, because at the core of it, what can be done with the shared band versus exclusive and where that line is or whether that line needs to move will be informed by the data. And for that, both usage, coverage, power, how is it being used, all the operators, how are they using it, and could they have done it differently would be very important.
What qualifies as spectrum usage is actually a deeply complicated question, and we released an NOI at the FCC in 2023 that explores precisely these types of questions. As Tom noted, you can slice up utilization by time, by frequency, and by spectral occupancy. And, there are a lot of cuts that are involved. And, I think it's healthy going forward that there be a more productive conversation about what does success look like in this band, and how do we gauge success in a way that's quantitative, right? That isn't just pointing to our favorite examples, but actually gets to the heart of the matter.
I think you also have to look at the kind of the opportunity costs. When I was mentioning the drive tests we did a few years ago, or CTI did a few years ago, comparing CBRS usage to C-band usage, in that context, I remember when the C-band first became available, which was years after CBRS, or at least a year or two. As soon as they turned it on, Ookla reported some users saw their speeds increase 5 times, like overnight. And so it'll be important to look at how CBRS is being used, but you also need to consider, what the alternative might have been. Because if we could have deployed CBRS spectrum the way we deployed C-band, it would have been you would have seen a huge difference in user experience.
I think in that mix should also be an acknowledgement of the complete disruption of sunk investment and the effect on deployment that a change in the band and in technical parameters would cause for future auctions and a future auction chilling effect. That's not spectrum usage, but that's an important input to the economics of auctions and investment and reliance going forward.
Yeah, and looking at these audience questions, sorry, just saw them. I think the NTIA report might also include data up through 2024. Maybe I thought it was up through 2023, but still there's 2 years worth of data that hopefully will come out soon or is measured. I guess deployment data, I don't know if they have reporting requirements or if it can be surveyed. And yeah, the way the FCC considers spectrum usage, we need economists like Paroma's team to measure that or to compare. Let's see. And for use cases here, yeah, there is a mixture of like fixed, which is kind of what makes it hard to measure. You have low power, you have high power, you have indoor use, outdoor use, mobile use, fixed use. So how you would measure that across so many diverse users would be an interesting challenge. Paroma, do you have thoughts about, measuring, as can you put a dollar figure?
When we think about sort of measuring sort of the impacts that a technology has on, say, the economy, we do these economic impact studies where we study if you sort of invest in one part of, say, the telecom area, what happens to additional uses and additional economic impacts. So I think sort of a larger economic impact study is where my head would go when I think about the impact CBRS has had. However, along with that, to give a true picture, you would also need something like a C-band study, right? Because the CBRS part does not exist on its own. So you would also need sort of a study saying, okay, here's the economic impact that CBRS has had, and here's the economic impact that C-band has had. Now let's sort of see how these two compare for a complete picture. And what these economic impact models do is it also allows you to capture sort of impacts on other sectors and economy-wide sectors and not just purely telecom sector. So it gives you a much more complete picture.
If I had the money, I would buy that study.
Thank you. we would do it even without the money if the FCC told us to. That is something I'm deeply interested in, even learning academically.
Okay, and here, I have another fact from Michael Calabrese in the comments that there was a second NTIA report through 2024, and that fixed wireless deployments are a huge part of the benefits of this band. So you'd have to value that coverage and the WISP usage.
Again, fixed wireless is another example where it doesn't hinge on CBRS, and in fact, a lot of the WISPs using CBRS pre-existed CBRS. They were operating under Part 90, and so you can't attribute those WISPs to CBRS because they were around before CBRS.
Right. So if you did your study, you'd have to figure out what percentage of their cover or their service is only CBRS spectrum. So you can't attribute like all.
Well, it's not so much that it's that spectrum, it's that they were using that spectrum under the rules that existed before CBRS. And new WISPs could have done the same even without CBRS.
Yeah, and then the rebuttal here is that, well, actually CBRS has higher power, and that that would be the contribution of the CBRS rule that wasn't there before, and enables BEAD obligations. So I guess it would be a really good study to see, put some FCC economists on it, or external folks. I guess in the docket, no one submitted an economic analysis of CBRS. Maybe that RPAN, a further notice of proposed rulemaking, should request more economic analysis.
Paroma said she'll do it for free, so you know.
Don't quote me on that. That's academic in me speaking.
But really, like, a good study would have, all those data points in it, and be able to compare the power limits, the geographies, the uses, the time, and yeah, how we would get that data is difficult because there's so many different users, and there aren't reporting requirements. Like, you'd have to estimate, I guess, or ask folks to self-report.
Well, the SAS administrators have a lot of this data, and in fact, Federated Wireless, I think, it talked about the possibility of producing what they called a heat map of coverage, which I think would be a good learning tool.
Yeah. Okay. So any final questions or thoughts from you all, like closing statements or corrections for the record?
I'm just glad I didn't get homework out of this. Paroma and Arpan seem to have both gotten so.
Yeah, let me just say, just generally, the FCC is very active on spectrum at the moment. It wasn't until, even like late last year, we were in the midst of what Chairman Carr called a spectrum malaise. And starting at the beginning of 25 and culminating up into the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, there was a lot of good discussion in the interagency at the White House on studying candidate bands for spectrum. And we did get some real homework out of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, most notably Upper C, which we have to auction by 27, at least 100 megahertz of that. We put out a notice of proposed rulemaking seeking to go up to 180. And, we're making good progress so far, and that's our number one priority. But beyond that, there were a couple of call outs in the presidential memorandum released a couple of months ago, including 2.7, 4.4, and lower 7. And, we know NTIA is hard at work looking at those bands, and I expect that those will be part of the pipeline in the upcoming years. And then we have some other, bands in the hopper, potentially in inventory. We got our AWS-3 auction is coming up this summer. So we're very, very busy on the spectrum front. CBRS is always a good conversation to have, and I'm glad to be part of it. But, in the grand scheme of things, we have more immediate goals on the horizon. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Well, thank you all for your time and for a good debate about CBRS and spectrum policy in general. We have our next webinar is in 2 weeks, and it's preparing for WARC 27. So please stay tuned for that. And then we'll have a fireside chat with Administrator Roth in March. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.